Coming up on Levin TV, Part 2, the debt bomb and its devastating effects on you and your family. And it all starts now.
This is where freedom reigns.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Levin TV on CRTV, Conservative Review TV. I'm back. I want to continue on the subject that I was discussing at some length in the last evening's show. We talked about the series of government shutdowns that have taken place since the Budget Act was passed in 1974, 18 of them. Stay with me. Oh, my God, I just can't stand it. No, stick with me, because you're not going to get this anywhere else. As they quibble about the government shutting down, they quibble over this, that, and the other, and some of this really isn't quibbling. I mean, the Democrats are constantly now using the budget process to advance their radical left agenda. They're more than happy to shut down the government, of course. This time it's not a water project, or it's not obstructing some necessary a military missile system to confront the Soviets and so forth. Always destructive as the left is. No, this time they want to shut down the government in order to ensure that over 800,000, it's more like 2 million, illegal immigrant aliens, or illegal aliens, receive legal status. The dreamers. Every single one's a dreamer. Not a single nightmare among them. Isn't this amazing? Even in the United States, is every kid a dreamer? And we're not even talking about kids now. We're talking about people mostly in their 20s and 30s. So they're prepared to shut down the government unless they get what they want, which is more Democrats. Now, Paul Ryan, who likes to remind me in the very rare times that we speak, and I haven't talked to him for a long time, that I agree with you, Mark. I've read all your books. I've read all your books. I agree with you. But clearly he doesn't, and he didn't, because they just threw in there in the pot for the Democrats CHIP, child health, this, that, and the other program, and an expansion of it. So there are the Democrats in the minority, at least ostensibly in the minority, which is negotiating with the Republicans, blackmailing them over what they want. The Republicans are starting to cough up concessions, and the Democrats are just sitting there smiling. So what is it with these people? Anyway, let's take a more fulsome look at what we're talking about here and why the issue on the table should be the debt. After all, this is the budget, right? Spending, borrowing, taxing. That is what should be on the table. And the Democrats are good at spending, they're good at taxing, and they're good at creating the debt. Apparently the Republicans are too. So I pulled some of these charts that I wanted to show you from these official charts of the debt in the United States. So let's begin. Go ahead. Something wrong here, isn't it? Look at this. Gross public debt from 1900 to 2020, estimated out to 2020, in billions of dollars. Look at this chart. That's a skyrocket. And now, you can say, well, look at World War II, look at the Korean War, look at the Vietnam War, and so forth and so on. Just look at this. This is massive redistribution of wealth. Entitlements out of control. The progressives have won. They've won. It's only a question now of how fast we get to the edge of the cliff. Not if we're going to get to the edge of the cliff. It's just stunning, and I wanted you to see that. Now look at the next chart here. Accumulated gross federal debt from 1792 to 2020 as a percentage of the gross domestic product. Now this is crucial. You can see during World War II and shortly thereafter, we were in a military spending situation. It was survive or die. And so whatever had to be done, and at that point about a third of the federal budget went to the military, as it needed to, because look what we were facing. So then it begins to come down as World War II is over, and then it begins to go up. Now one of the reasons it begins to go up is because in the 1950s and early 1960s, the Democrats expanded Social Security. The Democrats and Republicans created Medicare and Medicaid. And so you have these huge entitlement programs. Like them or not, I'm explaining the statistics. And so, again, rather than a third of the money going to the military, now 60% of federal spending goes to these programs, these pension programs, health care programs, entitlement programs. And so the trajectory starts. On top of all that, the Democrats keep taxing and spending on all the other domestic issues. But the key, again, is what I want you to look at. Look at the estimated amount. Look at the estimated amount right there, 2020. From about, really now, until 2020, because we're in 2018, the accumulated gross federal debt as a percentage of the economy is over 100%. Let me make it simple. Again, our economy produces about $17.6, $17.7 trillion in wealth, services, and products. Our fiscal operating debt is over $20 trillion. So the fiscal operating debt is now bigger than the entire economy. You could take every penny out of the economy and you couldn't pay down the fiscal operating debt. I want you to think about that. Every single penny. Now, the reason this is underreported is because they don't talk about unfunded liabilities. That is, okay, on the books, those of you who have small businesses or just, you run the family budget. You have mortgage payments you have to make, and maybe you have health care payments you have to make, utility payments you have to make, maybe you're helping your kid pay on their student loan and everything. These are called unfunded obligations. You don't need all the money at once, but at some point you got to pay it, right? Well, the same applies to the federal government. And we have unfunded liabilities of over $220 trillion. Promises to people today, promises to people tomorrow, promises that will have to be broken. And I'm telling you, our politicians do not have the political will to address this. When you have a politician like Bernie Sanders, and he's very popular in the Democrat Party, 45% of the Democrats in the last primary election among the Democrats voted for Bernie Sanders, a communist. When he's talking about, on top of this, free education, free health care, free this, free that, and he has a big following. And really, the position, the so-called mainstream Democrat position, is not much different. And you can see how this may well end, which is in a very, very ugly situation. Next chart, please. Combined gross public debt. Now, what does this mean? Combined gross public debt. Well, there's three levels of government. There's the federal government, state governments, and local governments. The green, you just saw that in the prior chart, that's the federal government. The red, that's local government. The blue, that's state government. So when you add them in, you can see the percentage of the GDP absolutely shoots through the roof. You're looking at, right now, about 125% of the debt. So let's say the gross domestic product is 100, the debt is 125. So the debt is about a quarter larger when you add all levels of government than the economy each year. And it's only going to get worse. Let's look at the next chart, please. Interest. You know, just like you pay interest on your loans and your outstanding debt, so does the federal government. That's how it gets money. Federal government gets money in many ways. It borrows money from itself. Now, you know that's a disaster. Have you ever borrowed money from yourself and then charged yourself interest with the promise to pay yourself down the road? Well, that's what the federal government does. Or they borrow it from foreign countries, like the Chinese have $1.2 trillion of our debt, or they just print it. But you have to pay interest on this debt as it accumulates. And what they're doing is pointing out this massive interest from 1900. You can see 1990, during the Clinton years, during the Bush years, and then you can see it's going to shoot up in the 2020 and so forth. The percentage of the GDP, the percentage of interest being taken out of the gross domestic product is growing. And it's only going to get worse. This stops at 2020, 2 years from now. But if you would see further out years, and I have on other charts, it is through the roof. 175%, 180%, 200%. In other words, so massive is the debt that it devours the economy, and you have to pay interest on it at some point. This is one of the reasons the Federal Reserve is keeping a lid on the debt, on interest rate. It's not just you. It's not just the economy. Every time it raises interest by a quarter interest, a 0.5%, maybe 1% or so forth, it adds to the federal debt. And then money has to be found, if the budget was working properly, to start paying that interest. So you're talking about over $20 trillion, not unfunded liabilities. You're talking about fiscal operating liability, over $20 trillion. We have to pay interest on that debt on a continuing basis, not just every year, but every day. And the bigger that debt gets, and eventually the bigger the interest gets, essentially the government and the economy are devoured by three things: the debt, the interest on the debt, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. At some point, that'll be everything. There won't be anything left for anything else. And that's what your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren have before them. There is no question about it. And this is not being discussed today, wasn't discussed yesterday, and it won't be discussed tomorrow by Congress, the media, the president, anybody. It's getting so completely out of control, they're not sure how to handle it. And politically, I don't think you can handle it. Can you imagine trying to reform any of these programs? Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, the so-called CHIP program. Can you imagine? It's been tried, and then people back off immediately. Can you imagine really trying to cut the debt, saying, you know what, federal spending should be 98% of what it was last year, not 102%. Can you imagine doing that? The filibuster rule in the Senate, the propaganda media, CNN, MSNBC, and all the rest of them, any politician that proposes this, of course, they're going to be eviscerated. So no single politician has proposed any of them. Next chart. This is 2012 to 2022. Obviously, we're in 2018 right now. This just shows you that the gross public debt up, 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 up every year. Now, you can't do that in your own family. At some point, you're paying down your mortgage. At some point, you're paying down the interest that you're paying on your car if you took out a car loan. At some point, you're paying down the interest on your student loan. The federal government never pays down anything. Now, this illusion is created. This illusion has been created. Well, the government's different. It's not like a person. It's not like a family. They can print money and create currency. At some point, the government is not different. The government is made up of human beings. The laws of economics are the laws of economics. And they don't change, just like the laws of physics. You can wish them away. They're not going to go away. And we have seen nations that have spent themselves into disaster. There's one right now. It's called Venezuela. There was one called the Weimar Republic that led to Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. You can look all over the world. There's examples everywhere. When the economy collapses, the society collapses. And when the society collapses, it's the law of the jungle. Everyone for himself. There are things we can begin to do today, but we're reaching a turning point now where there is going to be a point at which we can't do a damn thing about it. It's just too big. And it'll be on a trajectory that's out of control. And that's why I have so much contempt for these politicians, both parties, whomever they are. We talk about the government shutdown because we want to make sure the illegal alien children are taken care of. Look at the enormity of what I'm talking about. Well, they're focused on their own damn agendas. If it's not water projects, it's something else. It's illegal alien so-called children, most of whom aren't children. This country is driven by the left. The progressives have succeeded for the last century. The Republicans, A, don't know how to respond to it, B, don't want to respond to it, C, are too stupid to know how to respond to it, or 3, don't believe in capitalism, in limited government, and getting your house in order. And I really am starting to believe that, particularly the treatment that Ted Cruz got in 2013 when he was trying to fight trying to fight Obamacare. Now, just to give you some more information on this topic, again, I write these books not just to write them, and after a year they're done. They're everlasting as far as I'm concerned. There's information and plunder and deceit that is intended for all of you. And in part, I point out that in 2014, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released its annual long-term budget outlook. The document provides an extensive analysis of projected government spending, debt, and obligations. Now, what's interesting is the Congressional Budget Office is an arm of Congress. It can be manipulated, and it's often been manipulated, but here it's trying to tell its own taskmaster, hello, we have a little bit of problem on this debt, you might want to pay attention to it. And of course, they don't want to pay attention to it, because when you're taking goodies from somebody, you might lose votes. It's much easier just to keep giving them stuff. It's easier to increase the debt. It's easier to raise taxes on the so-called rich. It's easier to bamboozle people, and then you feel good about it. We have bipartisanship, and everybody goes home, and that's the way it works. CBO reported that between 2009 and 2012, the federal government amassed the largest budget deficits relative to the size of the economy, that is the gross domestic product, since World War II. Those are during the during the years of the Obama administration. The deficit levels were almost twice the percentage of the deficit at the end of 2008. So Trump is negotiating essentially with the same Democrats who did this to us. He's also having to deal with Republicans who cut deals with Obama, like sequestration. And that's where we get, you can only increase defense spending by $1 if you increase welfare spending by $1. And you can hear them talking about it now. So measured in dollars, the federal deficit in 2008 was nearly $500 billion. Now this is 10 years ago. That's still a ton of money. By 2012, the deficit was, the yearly deficit, not talking about the overall debt, the yearly deficit in 2012 was $1.4 trillion. 1 year. $1.4 trillion. In 2014 alone, the federal budget deficit was larger than the combined market capitalization of Apple Computer, ExxonMobil, and Microsoft, three of the world's largest corporations. In 2014 alone, the deficit was bigger than three of our biggest massive corporations. Economists discuss these budget deficits in terms of the percentage of GDP, which is what I just went over. Now, increased public debt also means increased debt servicing costs, interest, particularly when the Federal Reserve eventually discontinues its artificially low interest rate policy. When the Fed starts to raise interest rates, rising interest expenses to the Treasury is going to exacerbate the climb in the deficit, according to economist Michael Unglin of the Action Economics LLC, which is quite obvious. The interest counts as part of the debt. So you have the government borrowing from itself, the government paying interest to itself, which means you and I, you see this accumulated debt, this accumulated interest on top of the debt. This is a Ponzi scheme. That's exactly what it is. It's a Ponzi scheme that is going to destroy future generations, particularly those yet born. They're going to be born into this. That's why I wrote this book to begin with, Plunder and Deceit, and that's why I asked the question, are we as parents, are we even moral anymore? Do we even understand what we're doing to our children and grandchildren? Particularly those parents, quite frankly, who are progressives, who keep voting for progressives. And they seem to act like they can continue to do this without consequence. The increase in interest payments by the federal government will consume a still larger portion of the federal budget, thus increasing the gap between remaining revenues and government benefits and programs. Interest payments are expected to more than double relative to the size of the economy. By the way, as a footnote, some of the most important shows I do here on Levin TV are some of the least flashy, because I try to provide you as much information, detailed information, as I possibly can. So if you're really interested in looking into this further on your own, you can go ahead and do it. That's why I give you the sources, I give you the data, and you can check it out. I'm not just here with a conga line of guests screaming at each other. I'm hoping you get something out of this. And I think that's why you watch Levin TV. Now, the truth is the truth. So I'm going to touch a subject you're not allowed to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it. Social Security and the federal government's health care programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. And by the way, the Republicans just threw in on CHIP more money to the Democrats to try and prevent a government shutdown, while the Democrats are demanding legalization for illegal alien so-called children. So, Social Security and the federal government's health care programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, and subsidies related to Obamacare will double in relative costs over the next several decades. For the past 40 years, they have together consumed an average of 7% of the gross domestic product, but they're expected to increase to 14% of the gross domestic product by 2039. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid account for 60% of the government's non-interest expenditures in recent years, steadily growing as a share of annual federal expenditures. What are you doing, Mark, attacking these programs? I want to save them. I want to save them. I'm looking at the facts, the mathematics, the science of this. These programs are going to collapse. The Social Security trustees, the Medicare trustees say, hey, we're out of business in 17 years. Hey, we're out of business in 11 years. That's not far from now. So what do? You address it. How do you address it? Many people have proposed very humane ways to deal with this. People who are currently on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, you leave them alone because they relied on the representations of the government. They paid into these systems, and they were told what they would get. Fair is fair. But then there are some of us who are younger, 20, 30, 40 years old, and we should have a new deal if we're going to address this, because they're going to have nothing anyway. And so what should it be? Well, you rearrange these programs so they're sustainable. What did the left do in this country? Not just the Democrats, but the Republicans too. Another Ponzi scheme. You know what they did? They took all the money you all have paid into Social Security and stole it. You don't have a trust fund. You know, they send you this letter every now and then, I get it now and then, telling you how much money you're going to get when your Social Security pays. They don't have any money. The Treasury Department took all the money to spend it on daily operating expenses of the federal government. And then what they gave the Social Security Administration and what is in your account is an IOU. It's an IOU. So what the federal government has done is they said, we owe that money, but in the meantime, we're spending it on something else. That's not a pension program. Everybody who's done that should be arrested, in my opinion, and should be charged. They really should. They destroyed Social Security. They destroyed Medicare. Even though they were actuarially really nearly impossible in the first place, at least they were manageable for a period of time, and you could adjust them over time. But these leftists and Republicans stole the money out of Social Security and Medicare. Do you know that 2 summers ago, the Disability Trust Fund under Social Security went bankrupt? Well, Mark, how can that be with the IOUs? Because there's not enough money even to pay off the IOUs. Did anybody tell you that? I told you that. Because it was a little report that was put out by these Social Security trustees and said, hello, Disability Trust Fund's gone. Okay, move along. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And what are we debating today? Legality. Legalizing illegal aliens. That's what we're debating today when it comes to the budget. So I am pointing this out in order to try and save these activities and try to do it in a way that tells us how we can do it. In other words, with experience, with real numbers, and so forth. But you're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to do it anymore. Now, for example, as I point out, in 1970, social programs, all of them, accounted for 32% of the total federal expenditure. 1/3. Social Security programs grew to 44% of federal expenditures in 1980, 44%, and 1990, and 54% in 2000. 54% of all federal spending is going into Social Security, which is really not true. It's on a docket. It's on an account that 54% is supposed to go to Social Security. That money doesn't even exist anymore. But let's play along. So what they're saying is 54% of the federal budget. Okay? Now, they were promoted as safety net programs for the protection of the poor, elderly, and vulnerable. But in each case, the programs have snowballed because what's happened is successive Congresses have expanded them. They've changed them. They've altered them. Each case, the programs have snowballed and become unsustainable. The CBO expects their spending percentages to continue increasing indefinitely. Now, that can't go on indefinitely, can it? Although this topic will be addressed, I address it more fully later, there are currently 58 million people receiving Social Security benefits. By 2024, 6 years from now, that number will grow to 77 million, from 58 million to 77 million. And by 2039, 21 years from now, there will be 103 million eligible beneficiaries. Tell me, why can't we raise the age of... If you're 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old, people live much longer than they did in the 1940s and so forth. Why can't we raise the retirement age to 72 from 65? Oh, we can't do that. Sure we can. Particularly if you believe in these programs, we're going to have to do it for future generations, for younger people just coming into the workforce. There's no reason we can't do it. We're going to have to do things like this. Average benefits are on the rise, as is the number of people qualified to receive benefits. Over the next 10 years, there will be a 38% increase in the number of people over 65 years of age entitled to receive Social Security benefits, because our population is getting older and older. So more and more people will be retiring at 65 and older, and less people will be working to pay into the system. And we now know what you're paying into the system goes in one door and out the same day. And so it's these younger people who are going to be paying into the system. The same younger people who are going to have to deal with over $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. This is what I'm saying. This is just completely out of control. Increases will be caused in significant part by the influx of retirees and beneficiaries and the outstretched benefits promised by these programs, particularly with the huge expansion of federal health care spending. Over the next 10 years alone, the percentage of people reaching retirement age will grow from the current 14% to 21%. Concurrently, the number of income-producing individuals will drop from 60% to 54% of the population. CBO projects that trend to continue as life expectancies increase. Obviously, that means there will be fewer taxpayers available to pay the freight, a crushing burden imposed on younger people and future generations. Nobody cares. You know why? Nobody represents generations yet born. They don't vote. They don't vote. So not only is federal spending out of control, it's also inefficient and poorly monitored. This doesn't get discussed while they're discussing legalization for illegal aliens and how much they want to spend and whether the government shut down. That is, the federal government is a lousy manager, a disastrous manager. A recent report issued by the Comptroller General of the United States disclosed that duplicative or overlapping federal spending programs exist in 132 areas, from teacher training to job training. Now, Gene Dodaro, who is the Comptroller General, he also found that improper payments by 18 different federal departments in 2012 cost the federal government a whopping $107 billion. $107 billion. Improper payments in 18 different federal departments. In fact, so bad is the federal government's management of its massive resources that the General Accountability Office, GAO, found the accuracy of most of its financial reporting, that is, the federal government's, suspect. In its last audit of the federal government, the GAO concluded there are significant and material weaknesses in the accounting performed at all levels of the federal government. Among other things, it declared that this incompetence, number one, hampers the federal government's ability to reliably report a significant portion of its assets, liabilities, costs, and other related information. Two, it affects the federal government's ability to reliably measure the full cost as well as financial and non-financial performance of certain programs and activities. And three, it impairs the federal government's ability to adequately safeguard significant assets and properly record various transactions. Four, it hinders the federal government from having reliable financial information to operate in an efficient and effective manner. In addition to the three major impediments, GAO identified other material weaknesses, which I won't get into right now. They're not only spending us into bankruptcy and oblivion, the money they get, they're not managing. not properly. And then, as I point out, the nation's increasing debt burden will wreak havoc on the economy in very specific ways. Higher interest rates, slower economic growth, weaker job markets, higher taxes, higher inflation rates. The CBO notes that the enormous amount of government securities required to finance debt crowd out investments by individuals and businesses in the private market, including in manufacturing, research, infrastructure, and small and large business opportunities. Because wages are determined mainly by workers' productivity, the reduction in investment will reduce wages as well, lessening people's incentive to work. You can see this is the unraveling of the civil society, the unraveling of an economy. This is not abstract. It's not theoretical. Look at Venezuela. Look at all kinds of countries across the world. In order to compete for investments, both government and private borrowers will face higher interest rates. And while those rising interest rates will encourage individuals to save, the offsetting growth in interest costs will increase the cost of borrowing, thus further driving up the cost of debt. I know this is a tough show to listen to today. I understand it. Now, let me ask you a question. We have an explosion of new news platforms in this country. On cable, on satellite, of course, we have them on network, we have it in social media. You know, we have digital as we have here. An explosion of new formats to provide information and facts to you. Well, given all the cable channels we have, how come this isn't discussed in any thorough way? CNN won't touch it. MSNBC won't touch it. We have network TV. You know, more people still rely on CBS and ABC and NBC. They won't touch it. I mean, this is, to me, this is the biggest story. The biggest story in America is how slowly but surely, and even more than slowly, increasingly rapidly, we are spending ourselves into an absolute and complete disaster. And here we are, at the precipice of a government shutdown. And listen to what they talk about. The fact of the matter is we're going to have a government shutdown one day, not for 1 day, not for 2 days, not for 3 weeks. It's going to collapse, and it's going to take the economy with it, just like a drain, just like a sink in a drain. And when it takes the economy with it, everything you've saved, everything you have worked for is going to be gone. Again, we've done a special, more than one, I think, on Venezuela. These things happen. They can happen to a great country. You know, some people have very interesting hobbies. I have very boring hobbies. I read. I want you, those of you who may from time to time read and time to time be interested by history, I want you to look at Athens. I want you to look at what happened to Athens. Now, Athens would come back, but Athens was destroyed first from within through its democracy. And we owe a lot to Athens, we owe a lot to the Greeks, including democracy and the idea of democracy. But Athens was corroding, rotting from within. So corrupt with these so-called governing elders that essentially they put Socrates to death, even though he killed himself because he wouldn't submit to the government doing it. He could have confessed to all kinds of violations of their thinking and their ideology and so, but he wouldn't do it. One of the greatest men to ever walk the face of the earth, Socrates. And Socrates' student, Plato. Plato's student, Aristotle. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Athens gave us then. Athens came before Greece. You might say, well, Athens is part of Greece. Well, Greece would come later because basically Greece, quote unquote, was a collection of individual states, much like our Articles of Confederation at the time. It was a very loose connection of states and countries, and eventually the Persians would defeat Athens, and eventually the Greeks, which would then combine these various nation states and towns and so forth, defeated the Persians. Look at Rome. Rome lasted for over 500 years. We're not even close to 300 years yet. Rome was theoretically a democracy, but look how, just like Athens, it turned on itself. It turned on Cicero. Cicero, one of the great thinkers and writers of all time. was a senator in the Roman Senate, and he objected to the centralization of power under Caesar. And a brilliant man. He wrote many, many wonderful things, and he often commented on the writings of the Greeks, including Aristotle and so forth. Eventually, Cicero had to go on the run, go on the lam, because he was being hunted down. They wanted to assassinate him. He was one of the great minds, again, to ever walk the face of the earth, one of the greatest men. And they eventually got Cicero. For a couple of years, he was on the run, and he was hiding in a wagon, and they were looking for him, and some of the locals revealed his identity. And when they caught up with him, the Romans, and he was in the back of the wagon, and he laid prone, as the reporting goes, and laid out his neck, because he knew what they were going to do. They were going to decapitate him. They were going to cut his throat. And he told them to go ahead. And he made the point. He said, you're making a terrible, terrible mistake, what you're doing. But I know I can't stop you. So Cicero was murdered. In this country, we don't do it that way, but we quiet voices of reason, voices of responsibility, voices who understand history. They are trashed. And what I'm trying to do with this show is bring them to life, and to bring these issues to life. Athens is no more. Well, there's Greece, but Athens as was is no more. Rome is no more, as Rome was. There's Italy, but not Rome in the sense of Rome from ancient times. And you can see the United States, I mean, if you understand these things and you look back on ancient history, you have to worry about where we're headed here. No country, no society is guaranteed to exist in perpetuity. None. And what our founders gave us is something that has never happened before. I talk about Athens, I talk about Rome. You have the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment in Germany, the Enlightenment in France, the Enlightenment in Britain, the European Enlightenment. We've talked about this. We had the great thinkers like Locke, who had enormous impact on our founders. The great thinkers like Montesquieu had enormous impact on our framers and our constitutional system. And they weren't alone. There were many others. And this country, America, was actually established based on some of the greatest thinking and writing of the Enlightenment. And when John Locke wrote his great second treatise on government, which I've written about, the absolutely brilliant man, had an enormous impact on our country. Much of what he thought and wrote was lifted by George Mason in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and then about a month later by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. He was asked by his detractors, Locke was, you write these wonderful things about the civil society and individual liberty and so forth and so on, and they're all very, very lovely, but they don't exist anywhere. Where do they exist? And this is several hundred years before America's founding, and he said, America. They exist in America. Do they still exist in America? I would say some of us believe they do, and some of us are fighting to retain them. But there's a lot of people who just don't give a damn. They just don't give a damn. And this is why I asked on my radio program a few days ago, will America survive as America? And I think the answer is, and the answer I ultimately gave is, it can, but we're in decline. It can, but we're in decline. And I can be here and tell you I'll put a smiley face on all this, and I can be a Pollyanna like other people who want to get the ratings up and so on. I don't have ratings on Levin TV. I have you. You're a subscriber. But I can't ring the bell of alarm in one hand and then in the other hand tell you everything's fine. Everything is not fine. And on that happy note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wish you a wonderful weekend. We will be back here on Monday on Levin TV. And I want to thank you for watching.